Welcome. It feels so good to say that. It feels good for me to be here. I'm Steve Ehrman, Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning, and I'm the beneficiary of a tremendous amount of hard work that went into putting this event together, and you're the beneficiaries as well. I have only one educational thing to say to you this morning. Steve Ehrman, Steve Lerman.
Thanks. Yes, those of you who don't know, Steve Ehrman and I go back actually quite a long ways to our student years. And even then, there was endless confusion when we were at school together about who was who. And so this is just, for us, business as usual. I actually gave serious thought to not hiring him because just the sheer confusion. But then Steve Knapp commented that it had amusement value. And that we should just go ahead and do it. But it's been wonderful to have Steve here. He brings extraordinary talent. This event, along with, of course, the people who work with him, is an extraordinary event. I hope this will be the beginning of a great tradition here at GW to convene us as a faculty and staff and students who share, as a group interested in how we think about our teaching and our students' learning in a deeper and way that re-emphasizes the tradition here at George Washington University of great teaching as being part of the experience we provide all our students, and how we continue to reflect on how we teach and how our students learn so as to improve those outcomes. Teaching and learning is, of course, one of our core values here at GW. And that's part of the reason when I arrived here, and it didn't take very long, I've been here now 15 months as provost. Fairly early on in that process, I had decided that it was appropriate to create an Office of Teaching and Learning to bring together and expand a number of the opportunities and activities we have here on our campus around education. It took me a little while to get that together. My first year, I operated on the first do no harm theory, which was to say, let's not break anything that might be working perfectly well. But when I chose to reorganize my office, I wanted to clearly message and clearly resource teaching and learning in a way that made it unambiguous that as a university, we were committed to the absolute best quality of teaching to our students and to create for them the best learning outcomes we could do that was within our power. And so I chose to actually create a vice provostorial position, one of 6 such positions here at the university under the new organization I created in my office. And I wanted to find the absolute best person I could to lead that. And it turns out Steve, who lived in this area, someone I had known for many years, who has been a world leader in this field, and I couldn't think of anyone better qualified to take on that role. So it's wonderful to have him here. The office has several important objectives, things that Steve and I have worked together to help define. And a subset of those is, first of all, to help faculty share teaching insights and experiences. A place to bring together the faculty who think reflectively about their teaching, and of course encourage more of them to do so as to exchange their experience and practice, to cross-fertilize how we all try to help our students learn what works, what doesn't work, why it works, and in what contexts it works. And then I want to strengthen experiential learning here and its relationship to the formal classroom. And experiential learning takes an enormous number of has no number of manifestations. It's everything from service learning to internships. One of my personal passions, although I certainly love the other things equally well, is around undergraduate research. And I've spoken to the faculty and students about that many times. And I've asked Steve through this office to advance that agenda along with other experiential learning opportunities. And then to prove the support for excellent teaching. So working with P.B. Garrett and her organization to find as many ways as possible to support the faculty in its endeavors to improve the quality of instruction here. Along with the large events, big ones like this one, which I certainly think is a fantastic opportunity, the office will be offering a lot of smaller workshops, smaller events that seek to strengthen the network of faculty interested in teaching. We're going to create or we already started creating a network of faculty teaching fellows and advisors who will help lead efforts at smaller scale in their respective departments and schools to encourage conversation about teaching and encourage people to adopt new practices that seem to work, to encourage a culture of assessment in which we try to understand in a deep way, not in the shallow, superficial way, in a deep way what the learning outcomes for our students really are when we change the teaching process. And so all of that is under Steve's purview. It's a work in progress. He's developing plans. He's developing budgets. It is my intention, among other things, to seek more funding for those areas. I will personally be out advocating for donors to think about contributing to that as one of the possible things that in a way they might help GW philanthropically. So that's all by way of backdrop to this fantastic gathering. But it's now my pleasure to talk to and introduce our speaker, one of our two speakers actually, Dr. Carl Wieman. He is a Nobel laureate who has become interested, or actually before even getting his Nobel Prize, was deeply interested in teaching science. And I think he's the perfect inaugural speaker for the first teaching day here at GW. He has a tremendous passion for new knowledge in his own chosen area, atomic physics, and he combines that with an incredibly strong desire to understand how students learn and help them and help educate them, particularly with respect to the sciences and mathematics. A few pieces of biographical facts. I don't claim any special knowledge. This is gleaned from his autobiography, which goes up on the Nobel laureate Nobel Prize website. He grew up in Oregon and became fascinated by mathematics while a teenager. But interestingly enough, at the same time, his favorite subjects were actually literature and writing. He attended MIT, which happens to be my alma mater. He actually was graduated 1 year after I did. I know the dorm he lived in quite well from my experiences at MIT. While I chose to stay there, get my doctorate and stay on the faculty 35 years, he actually left for another great university, which happens to be on the West Coast, Stanford, a close competitor of MIT, by the way, in all the sports, as you might guess. Okay. As an undergraduate, he was deeply involved in research, and of course, as a graduate student, we're all involved in research. He joined the faculty of the University of Colorado in 1984, and then in 2001, he was honored with a Nobel Prize for his work in a form of matter called Bose-Einstein condensate, a form of matter predicted theoretically, but whose existence was empirically verified in the work he did. In 2004, he was recognized by the Carnegie Foundation as the U.S. Professor of the Year, and he currently serves as the Associate Director for Science in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And finally, he continues his work in physics along with his groundbreaking work in education, both at the University of Colorado and actually has an appointment at the UBC, University of British Columbia, since 2007. It's very clear that the things he chooses to do, he does deeply and with tremendous passion. And one of the things that's characteristic as you look at the arc of his career is his willingness to look for new things to do, but not motivated by the fact that he didn't enjoy what he was doing previously, but rather because his passions has shifted somewhat. So even going back earlier, he was actually a highly competitive chess player throughout Oregon. He used to play in tournaments, and as he says in his autobiography, he retired at the age of 16 from that pursuit, so he could concentrate on tennis and, of all things, studying, which I think is not a bad idea educationally. So today he spends much of his time thinking about and teaching about ways we can improve teaching of science, and particularly physics. And he's actually interested, and I'll quote, how physics is taught to students who are not planning on becoming physicists. I would like to generalize that even more. This is a great example. We need to teach everyone in this country how to think about science in an intelligent way, how to think about how we know things and how we come to learn them from the physical world, and how to apply that knowledge in thinking about broad range of issues that go way beyond science, such as public policy. I think more informed, intelligent thinking around what is true and not true and how we know it is crucial in the public policy domain, and in particularly in the political debate about the issues that are by far the most important pressing issues of our time. and how we know what we know and how it can then be used is going to be crucial to the future of this country and, in fact, to the globe. So with that introduction, it's my honor and my pleasure to welcome our first inaugural speaker for Teaching Day, Dr. Carl Wieman.
Okay, well, thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be the first speaker at this event. I'm going to talk about a scientific approach to learning and teaching, and there's a reason for that choice of order. You'll see how I'll argue how only by understanding learning can we really understand how to teach effectively. Now, I also want to say as an introduction that the work I'm going to talk about, I'm going to pull out little snippets of lots of different people's work, so only a small fraction of what I'm going to talk about is actually from my own science education research group. And I also want to emphasize that I'm going to concentrate on science, and most of my examples and data are from physics, but I hope I'll show you how these things actually extend across many other fields, and I could bring in data for this, but it's just, I'll try and show you how it's really, you can understand this at a basic cognitive level that applies quite broadly, certainly all the sciences and engineering and technical aspects, and I think I'll leave it to you to decide how much more broadly, but I would argue quite a bit more broadly than that. Actually, just so I get a sense here, I'm assuming that my audience is kind of faculty and graduate students primarily. And how many of you are in that category from the sciences or engineering? Okay, so I'm right on my guess, so it's most of you. So we've just heard a great reason why we need better science and engineering education. The first one was quite eloquently explained. But there's a couple of other reasons and why this is such a priority of my boss, the president. And that's just looking at the modern economy and how based on science and technology it is, how critical it is for the workforce, whether they're scientists or engineers or not. And so because of these needs, if you think about, okay, what's the educational goal? I'd argue it's really very much the same across all of these different requirements. And it's really that if you wanted to sum it up in one way, it's really we need to think about having our students think about and use science more like scientists. And the only distinction between the top to the bottom is really how far they go, how much time they take in that process. But the goal is always moving in that direction. And that's really, throughout my talk, you'll see that's really the criteria that I'm using about what's effective and what we want to learn. So that's a tremendous challenge, accomplishing, dramatically improving education for this wide spectrum. But I think there's some reasons to expect that we really can achieve this in a much more effective way than's been done in the past. And it really comes from recent research that's over the past 1 or 2 decades. It's come from 3 different fields. The cognitive psychology, laboratories on how people think and learn, the college science classrooms, and then even more recently, actually, the neuroscience and brain research. And these are coming together, actually, the results from all these fields, to give us quite a consistent, clear picture about what's important for achieving learning, particularly in learning of the sort of expertise in engineering and science. And today, I'll really just concentrate on the connections here between the cognitive psychology part and the college science classroom. Now, before I launch into sort of details, I wanted to to give you the idea that out of this research, it's really changing the whole paradigm of thinking about teaching. Like I say, particularly of these sort of complex expertise. The old paradigm was really that you have these brains and they vary in different ways coming into our education system. We immerse them in knowledge, and basically it soaks into different amounts depending on the different, how the brains vary to start with. Now, the new paradigm that the research is really showing us that, in fact, the technical term is the brain's plastic. What that means is the brain actually changes in quite substantial ways. And so learning expertise is really much more about the brains come into the classroom and they actually aren't that different. And they actually transform as a result of suitable exercise of them. And to the extent they're undergoing the same kind of exercise, they transform and thereby learn expertise in much the same way. And so the rest of my talk will really be just going into, filling in why we've come to understand that. In details, I'll talk a little more about what do we really mean by learning to think like a scientist or engineer? How can we break that down and understand it better? And then connect that up with data from the classrooms, showing how this matches up to research carried out in the classrooms. I'll give you a very quick list of what research tells us on what every teacher should know. It's essentially a checklist that you should be following. Are you addressing each of these 4 basic points? Really, from the 10-minute classroom exercise to thinking about your entire course and, in fact, your whole program of study students might go through. And then I'll finish with just giving you an example of actually how you implement these ideas in a real classroom setting that was the basis for a lot of the research. Particularly using some using some simple technology to extend the capabilities of the instructor. So starting with the cognitive psychology work on expertise. There's been a lot of research on this where they've studied what makes up expertise across a whole bunch of different fields of activity. And they find there's 3 very consistent characteristics about this. And so first, experts in any field have a whole lot of factual knowledge about their subject. That one's kind of obvious, but the others aren't. The second thing is experts in any given discipline have a particular mental organizational framework unique to that discipline by which they organize all of this knowledge that they have in such that they can retrieve and apply it in a very effective way. And these kind of organizational frameworks, they embody, recognizing certain complex patterns and relationships, that are important to the discipline. And much of what we talk about as scientific concepts, I would argue, is a way that scientists in a particular field organize a whole bunch of different pieces of information, sort of chunked together in a way that's a very efficient, effective way to use that information for solving problems. Then the third aspect of expertise is an ability to monitor one's own thinking and learning, at least in one's field of expertise. And so that means that an expert in a subject, as they're working on a problem, is continually asking themselves, do I understand this? Is this a sensible way to be tackling this problem? And they have resources they call upon that actually can answer those questions and thereby change what they're doing as a result. Now, as I say, the research has revealed that experts in all these different fields do all of these things, but it also has shown us that these are really fundamentally new ways of thinking, and nobody is, although we like to talk about prodigies in these fields, when you actually study it, nobody starts out having expert-like abilities to do these things, they only come about as a result of many hours, actually many thousands of hours of intense practice actually doing this. And it's become increasingly clear that what's happening is, and this is the paradigm shift, is it's not about transferring information to a largely static brain. It's really about exercising the brain strenuously, and as a response to that, quite analogous to exercising a muscle strenuously and the muscle changing and developing. In this case, the brain changes and develops, and it undergoes really quite significant changes, and those changes are really what is making the learning. And so how experts become experts has also emerged from cognitive psychology, that there are certain quite consistent characteristics, again, that apply across all disciplines. And this is, Anders Ericsson has really pioneered this research, but there's a very nice, readable, sort of, and quite accurate, I'd say, more popularized version of this, and Talent is Overrated, which I'd say is a starting point if you want to learn more about this. But so what goes into developing expertise, and what Ericsson has characterized the process of deliberate practice. And what it's made up of is tackling a series of challenging tasks or questions where the difficulty they have to be difficult. They have to require one to really stretch your brain, but they can't be impossible, so you can't get anywhere. And these tasks, not only the right level of challenge, but they also have to really quite explicitly practice expert thinking. And some of those ideas that make up expert thinking that are quite generic, this is my own working with science education across a variety of engineering and science disciplines. Some generic features are that having experts have a set of conceptual or mental models that they use. They have these complex pattern recognition systems and methods by which they test which of these models do and don't apply in a particular situation. They're this highly complex, based on experience, pattern recognition that allows them to sort out what's relevant and irrelevant information to solving problems. And they have this whole process of self-checking and sense-making to check what they're doing and the results they end up with. So this is a very abbreviated list. I can go into much more detail, and if you start to think about any particular discipline, you can break these down into many more sub-bites of the sort of cognitive tasks. But it's absolutely essential that if you want people to learn that, they have to quite explicitly practice doing those things. And so you, as experts in the field, that's really a unique thing you can be doing in understanding how to give the appropriate practice tasks to your students. And then in addition, a key aspect of deliberate practice, in addition to practicing this thinking, there also needs to be this process of reflection, both individual and then feedback from usually an expert, in the subject, an expert teacher, on giving feedback to the learner on what they're right, what they aren't right, and then helping them see how they can take this to the next step, the next more increasingly challenging activity. And so you do this over and over and over again, and basically a pretty standard number that emerges is after, if you do this intently for 10,000 or so hours, you will reach a sort of world-class level of expertise. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that with your students in your class, but what you should really think about is this is kind of a monotonically increasing function of expertise, and you want to do the best you can in the time you have to move them up that line towards becoming more expert by really building in these activities as much as you can. And so, you sort of think about, you really want to be exercising their brains as much as possible, and a very useful way to model an effective teacher is really one that's acting as a cognitive coach, designing the practice exercises, motivating the students, giving the feedback as they're working through this. Okay, so that's sort of the general cognitive part. Now I want to connect this up with the science classrooms, show you actually the data that supports that these ideas actually work in the classroom, and then give you some examples of that actually being done. So I'll start with research looking at conceptual mastery. As I've argued that's very much an expert-like skill, understanding what concept applies and using it effectively in a novel situation. And so this is something that there's been a lot of research on, particularly in physics, but it's grown into many other fields. And sort of the early work in this looked at certain basic concepts of force and motion covered in every first semester physics course, and studied how students learned and didn't learn these things. And there's been some good tools developed for actually measuring this, the earliest of which is called the Force Concepts Inventory. And it basically just tests students' mastery of this by giving them some simple real-world situations in which seeing how well they can apply these concepts like an expert does in those situations. Out of curiosity, how many here have heard of the Force Concepts Inventory before? Raise your hand. Okay, so a few of you, but most of you haven't. So anyway, I won't give you details, but it's things like when a car runs into a truck, they have to make basic qualitative predictions about that, and so on, that really can only be done by correctly applying these concepts. And so this and similar tests that have been developed along these same lines, the way these are now quite routinely used is you give them you have the students take the test before the course is started, and then take it again after they successfully completed the course. And you just look at, okay, which of the questions did they get wrong at the beginning, or how many did they get wrong at the beginning compared to how many they got wrong at the end. And that really tells you sort of the fraction of these basic key concepts that they actually learned over the course of taking the class. And so it's very much in education terms a value-added measure. This is now used very routinely in introductory physics courses around the world, but particularly in North America. And when you look at the results that come out of this fraction learned, you see some very striking results. They're striking because they're so robust. And if you take the fraction, of what they could have learned or needed, you desire them to learn, they actually did learn. You do an average over the class. You see, as Hake has shown here with this histogram, this is 16 different courses here from different universities. You might not be able to read this from the back, but basically the highest here is 28%. So that means that, on the average student in a standard lecture course never learned they always learned less than 0.3 of these important concepts that they didn't already know at the start of the course. The thing that makes this remarkable is that result holds up independent of how, the perceived quality of the lecture, the class, big classes, small classes, across different kinds of institutions. Harvard University and some local 2-year community colleges are in this data here. And we now get similar data from other areas of physics and other science disciplines, and it really just makes a very compelling case that the standard traditional lecture is simply an ineffective way of developing this kind of conceptual mastery. Now, the good news is that driven by this and other research, people have experimented with alternatives ways to teach, which, as I'll show you, are really much more like this deliberate practice that the cognitive psychologists tell us about. And those now, pretty consistently on this test, get people up in the range here of sort of 0.45 up to 0.7. Just to give you a little more data, here's some data that I particularly like because it involves a lot of the same instructors before and after, and it's lots of sections in a very controlled way. This was from Cal Poly, and they had been using a similar kind of conceptual test and tracking their students over many years. And they got just consistent when I showed you before. Their average here was just a little under 0.3. So by traditional lecture standards, that was pretty good. But then they introduced these, and they have a bunch of sections, a bunch of different instructors. They introduced what's called the studio physics approach. And what that really is they have a set, sort of a set of particular activities that the students do in the sections. And the instructors are there to facilitate the students working together on those activities. And when they took data there, basically they just got a factor of 2 jump, and it was really consistent that the noise, the scatter here really is just the statistics of small numbers. You can't say that any of these instructors are any better or any worse. They all, all of the students in all the sections and all the instructors doubled the conceptual mastery. And so it really emphasizes this idea that it's really the mental activities of the students that dominate. It's not really much to do with the external characteristics of the instructor. And I have to also just point out, to those who argue, well, effective teaching is kind of, an innate personality or genetic thing, and you can't really teach somebody to be a great teacher if they're not. I have to point out this particular case right here, who I think is quite a spectacular example disproving that. This person you can see, and I don't know who they are, I just know that their students are learning 6 times more here than they were before they changed the course. So that shows you pretty dramatically you can learn to be a vastly more effective teacher. And that it's really just, following scientific principles at some level. Here's an example from biology where it's a large introductory biology course at the University of Washington, where they had many of these similar practices that I referred to. They're being done now in the physics courses. And this is interesting because they were looking at the students' grades on their standard exams and looking particularly at the at-risk students, the low socioeconomic class and ethnic minority students. And basically, all the students improved, but these at-risk underrepresented students actually improved substantially more, about 1/3 of a grade on average, which, when you stop to actually think about the big picture of things and the failure rates, a 1/3 of a grade shift across the whole student population is really pretty spectacular. And then my final piece example here is actually some work that came from University of British Columbia, people I worked with there. And this was a very carefully controlled study of what students were learning just from the classroom experience. And it was done by taking 2 identical, or by lots of different measures, virtually identical sections of a big introductory physics course for engineers. And these had 270 students each. So this is an example of the differences you can make even on large scale, in some sense, good economic return courses. And the experiment was taking, so the control the control group was a professor who had been there many years, taught this course many times, got high student ratings, and he was fortunately highly competitive. And so that made us a good situation for comparing somebody who was firmly committed to demonstrating what he could show, giving good lectures, with basically an experiment. And the experiment was somebody who was actually a fairly inexperienced teacher, was a postdoc and had a physics PhD, but is quite young, but had been trained by me in the program I ran at UBC in this kind of deliberate practice way of teaching and putting into effect all the things I'll just show you we know about effective teaching. And so they had the same learning objectives, the same, exactly 1 week of class time for both cases. And then they had both sections immediately after that week took this exam that had been jointly developed. And so I'll let you think about a minute to what you would predict as to the differences in learning between these two cases here. And I won't put people on the spot to make predictions, but just think in your own mind what you'd expect might be the difference here. Well, so here's the histogram from the two sections on this test with the, in red is the standard lecture group, and in white is the histogram of scores from the experimental group. To keep this as objective as possible, it was a multiple choice test, and so random guessing is right down there. And so the effects are pretty spectacularly different here. And there's a few things I want to emphasize. First, it clearly has a big impact on the entire student population. So there's always the question, are you benefiting the poor students worse or the best students worse, in these different things? This shows you, look, you do it right and everybody moves up a lot. In fact, this tail out here, I wouldn't be surprised if, there's almost nobody from this section who's even average in that section, but we always have a handful of students, who switch sections because it matches up better with their coffee break time or something. And so I wouldn't be surprised if those aren't sneaking. But anyway. And, you also think about things like differences in failure rate, et cetera. And you can see there's obviously a profound difference in this kind of section. And now, I want to emphasize the difference here between the earlier work where they're looking at what happens in a whole course. This was really focusing on just how much they learn from the classroom experience, the time in which they have that's the best opportunity to interact with the instructor themselves. And so this is also looking at the attendance from these two sections and we developed some measures, or the people who ran the experiment developed some measures of engagement. And so the engagement went almost double. That didn't surprise me at all. I have to say I was kind of surprised about the attendance, but they sort of probed on this more. And it turns out in these big lecture sections, the observers said that students we'd be drifting in and out, essentially. And what happened in this section is they'd drift in, they'd get seriously engaged, and they'd stick. And so that's why the attendance of these two sections, which had been measured as quite identical for the previous 10 weeks, suddenly shifted here. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of research and data on these cognitive aspects of expertise, deep subject learning, conceptual mastery, et cetera. I want to switch to something which it's not a very good term, but lack of anything better, I'll sort of a non-cognitive aspect of expert learning. This really has to do with your perceptions and attitudes about the discipline and how it's learned. And this is something my own group has done a lot of the research on, as well as the University of Maryland group here just up the road. And if you interview lots of people about a particular discipline like physics, you find that their perceptions can lie on this spectrum from novice to expert, where expert's defined by something where all experts in the subject, physicists in this case, have the same consistent perceptions that they express. And so these cover in a few limited areas where there is clear expert consensus and novice variation. So first, just in the content of the discipline, the knowledge of physics. So a novice sees physics as made up of a whole bunch of just isolated little pieces of information, and you learn physics by memorizing all those little pieces of information. And an expert is, of course, sees physics as made up of this coherent set of very general concepts. And the source of that knowledge, that's the nature of the knowledge, the source of it, to an expert, of course, these concepts describe nature. They're established by experiment. To a novice, and I think I can always tell the people who've taught introductory physics in the lecture hall, because they're always nodding at this point, that they've seen this. To a novice, this information is just handed down by some arbitrary authority and quite unrelated to the world outside the classroom. And then finally, the problem solving in the discipline. To a novice, it's about problem solving is memorizing a lot of recipes and then looking and seeing, does the problem I'm given match the ingredients of which, matches the ingredients of which recipes, and then you basically mindlessly plug in and generate a solution. To an expert, of course, the physics problem solving is about using these systematic concept-based strategies, which are widely applicable, including into new contexts they haven't been used before, and that's what makes them useful, of course. This strategy is really only useful for passing physics tests, usually. So once you understand that people's perceptions lie on this range, and I want to emphasize this has nothing to do with any measures of ability or knowledge about the subject. That can vary wildly and quite independently from these perceptions. But these are just how you perceive the discipline and learning it. So once you learn this, you can develop surveys, and we have put a lot of work in developing validating surveys that we can use just like that force concept inventory. So we can give it to everybody in the class, and these are just, just take a few minutes for students to fill out, and have them fill out the beginning of the course and at the end of the course, and so you can see how much more expert-like the students become in their perceptions as a result of taking this course. So you figure they're coming in here somewhere in the middle, and you want to see how much they move up to be like an expert. Well, that's what you want to see. The reality of what we see and the Maryland group sees and all the work they've done is that for the average student in an introductory physics course, essentially in almost all courses except a few experimental ones now that have been demonstrated, the students end up, with a more Homer Simpson-like view of physics at the end than they did before they actually started, okay? And if any of you who are laughing are from biology or chemistry, more recently, our group, or the people back there that I don't supervise, developed equivalent surveys for biology and chemistry. Only have a little bit of data from biology, but it's looking much like physics, and chemistry is, if anything, is worse than physics in this regard. And, I could say a whole lot more about this area. I think it's critically important. It's really important from the point of view of sort of a scientific literacy and views about science and the things the provost talked about at the beginning. And it's really, and it's really serious. But it's also true that we've taken, particularly Kathy Perkins in my group's taken a lot of data looking at other things this correlates with, and it's the best predictor we know of to give that survey to students the first week they come into the university, and significantly better than any other predictor of who's going to end up a successful physics major 5 years later. Much better than, for example, looking at their physics course results after a year of classes. This turns out to these perceptions is about a 5 times better predictor. So these things are clearly really important for lots of things. You can understand, you have to look in detail why this is happening and understand kind of from a student psychological point of view. I don't have time to go into it, but I just want to leave you with, you really need to be thinking about this in your teaching. Okay, so what are some other things you should be thinking about? And this is back to my basic checklist, and obviously I don't have time I could spend an hour on any one of these things, but I'd say trying to summarize a lot of research into a few basic principles that apply to every setting and all levels of teaching is, I've been talking about this authentic practice of expert thinking, and it has got to be very extended and strenuous, and you need timely and specific feedback about. But there's some other things we know a lot about. Motivation is absolutely critical, and that comes out of the cognitive psychology literature, that people, anybody who's rational simply won't do this unless they understand there's a reason to put in all this effort. So motivation's really essential. Connecting with prior thinking. Obviously, that goes back to the motivation part. It goes back to the appropriate level of challenge part, and it goes back to the whole idea of you're really developing someone's brain. You have to know where it's starting from, and so these things are actually get into a lot of the sort of basic psychology. And a lot of the issues of diversity of backgrounds and preparation play out primarily in these aspects. And then the other aspect is just another sort of basic cognitive psychology thing that's really well established and really widely ignored, and so I just want to stress it here, is that we know a lot about how the brain works and memory works, and as teachers, we should be paying attention to that. And just, it's a very simplified overview. Memory can be thought of as 2 parts. There's the long-term memory, and that's what most of us think about memory. It's got this enormous capacity. It lasts for a long time. But it's hard to get stuff in there, and hard to get stuff in there that lasts a long time. There's a bunch of things that are clearly known about how to achieve this long-term retention. And then the other aspect is what's called short-term working memory, and that's the part of the brain that works on, dealing with things on very short time scales, remembering and processing them. And I'll just say a little bit about this limitations on working memory that are really critical in thinking about what one does in a classroom. Doesn't matter so much in homework and so on, where there's not time limits. But these limitations on working memory is really well established and widely ignored, as I say, but it's actually very nicely represented by this Gary Larson cartoon. And it basically comes from the fact that in contrast to the long-term memory, this working memory has an extremely small capacity. And in fact, it's much like a computer with a small amount of RAM, that the more things it's called upon to do and process, really the less it can learn and remember about anything. And in fact, you get the equivalent of sort of the blue screen of death with the average human brain, with only about 5 distinct new items. And what new means is that it's not anything connected in long-term memory. Now, you stop to think about that. That's just a tiny capacity, really. I like to drop in on lecture halls in my previous job, and it was seldom that I could go into a biology lecture in which they didn't have 5 new technical terms up on the, up on the board or the screen before the students had ever sat down, right? Without recognizing that if those students actually paid attention to those terms, there was not much more going to be conveyed in the next, 49 minutes. So, but of course, it's not just biology. So this is really a critical issue. There's a bunch of things one can do to minimize unnecessary demands on working memory. And you should do those. And you should think about every class what is going to be putting unnecessary demands, because it's going to have a very real cost in what your students are going to be learning every time. Now, knowing that I pushed my limit in this talk, I will also make sure that I get some artificial long-term retention for you. So, okay, so I'm just going to finish up, oh boy, as quickly as possible, by showing you an example of just, okay, how do you actually implement all these things? And I'll pick the hardest case of a big lecture class. And this is really, it's not the exact case as used in this science paper that I showed you the 2 distributions for, but it's a little simpler area of physics that more people can understand, or familiar with more people, but gives you the same basic principles and practices. So it's a big lecture hall like that. And it's teaching about, electric current and voltage. And so the first thing is that the students have a pre-class assignment to read these small number of specific pages in the text that deal with just the material that's going to be covered in the next class. And then in fact, in that experiment, both sections were told, students were told to do this, but only in the experimental section. They had a short online quiz right before class that both, tested them. That helps long-term retention, also rewards them. And then the class, rather than being built around transferring information to them, was built around these questions and tasks. And so the class would start with the very first thing would be this question of light, these bulbs with light bulbs with a battery, and asking the students to predict what's going to happen to the brightness of these bulbs, or this bulb, when this switch is closed, okay? Now, every student in the class has a clicker, which I assume everybody knows what they are now. Looks like this with 5 buttons on it. And so each individual student has to press the button that corresponds to what answer they think is correct, and then the computer records who they are and what answer they choose. It's important to emphasize that the clicker technology itself doesn't really do very much for learning itself. It really just facilitates the other good things that can happen, and so you really have to think about just how you can use to help out. In this case, it's really used, just some accountability. Students have to give an answer, they have to commit to an answer they're accountable for. Now, we don't actually grade these answers, but because they know the instructor goes in there and looks, that is a degree of accountability and commitment, and it turns out people just think about things in a profoundly different way when they are under those conditions than if you just say, think about this, decide on an answer. And so that really primes them to learn. Then the learning really takes place in the follow-up. So every student is part of a 2- or 3-person consensus group. They then have to talk to each other about which answers are right, which answers are wrong, what the reasons are those answers are wrong. And during that discussion, then the instructor isn't just standing up here. They're wandering around listening in on those conversations. And that listening in is giving them, a picture of what's going on in those students' brains. And so can know enormously more about what students are confused about, what they understand. And then that's followed by a whole class discussion where one then quiets people down and elicits volunteers or calls upon people. It's really easy to get people to talk after they've just been in these discussions from throughout the class. and gets them to give, their explanations and reasoning. And because the instructor has been sampling, they can make sure that they bring out all the relevant correct and incorrect reasons for everybody to sort of have in front of them and think about. And then you can finally show them the histogram results and you can do the experiment. In this case, I used a little more technology, computer simulation. Can you switch to the, we'll see if this works. So can you bring up the circuit, there it is. So I built this ahead of time. You can build any circuit you want. And then one can actually do this and see what happens, okay? And there's some things about why a simulation like this actually works better than a real experiment in helping students develop their mental models. Okay, can you switch back to the other? Sorry, I didn't realize there'd be quite, okay, there we go. Now, in a class like this, an example like this, this would typically be followed by 10 minutes or so of further discussion. And that 10 minutes is from students asking all sorts of questions that are basically, testing their mental models, seeing, bringing up other examples in different contexts to see if this makes sense and so on. There's just lots of interaction going on there, lots of feedback. The other things you have in those example classes, you can't do everything with clicker questions, and so you can have a whole series of different sorts of small group tasks where you give them questions they work on for a few minutes, talking to each other about. They might have to write something down, etc. I hope it's obvious from this how this is sort of giving them practice thinking like a physicist. They're having developed conceptual models. That question with the light bulb, that wasn't an accident. That's very carefully chosen because the only way you can answer that right is to have the correct concept of how electric current flows. And if you have a very common incorrect model that people have, you'll get the wrong answer. And in fact, as those students, the majority of those students did, as shown in that histogram. And so it really very much focuses on their conceptual model and examining that and adjusting and adapting that as necessary. And they're getting all this different feedback to refine their thinking, both in their interactions between students, the instructor listening in on these conversations, giving much more targeted, effective feedback, answering questions, and then just last and least is seeing the histogram of the clicker responses. And so it's interesting, people sort of think about, well, what's the instructor, they won't be talking at all in this, but we actually find that when we monitor classes that run this way, about half the time is spent with the instructors talking, but it's never from transmitting information to sort of a passive audience. The instructor talking is always reactive. It's reacting to questions, issues raised by the students during the discussion. And I'll have to say, the kinds of questions you get in this situation are much deeper, and so it actually requires much greater subject expertise, which can be a little unsettling the first time you have to deal with it, but it's actually then much more fun because it's much more intellectually engaging. Okay, so I'll finish up here and leave some time for questions. Many aspects of what I've talked about as effective teaching aren't entirely new or particularly new, but what really is new is the quality of the data we're getting on them and the understanding why they work, being able to link them to our basic understanding of cognitive processes of thinking and learning. And I just argued to rush out and do this because it really shows, it really leads to dramatic improvements in learning for all students. And So I think, you know, it's kind of essential as a country that we adopt this widely. And just to finish up, I'll make sure my copies of my slides are available. And if you want to learn some more things about some of, you know, there's lots of things you could read, but some of my favorite references here, there's How People Learn from the National Academy, this couple books here, and then a much shorter but more poorly written article by me. And then finally, if you're with this, that circuit construction kit is one of many, about 100 simulations, all different areas of physics. You can just download them off the web, run a regular browser if you want to use this. And finally, probably what's most useful is this is the Science Education Initiative website at UBC, where we've been working now with many different instructors across many different departments to departmental change. And we've collected a fairly extensive set of resources there across a variety of areas about these different teaching techniques, research results, and so on. And hopefully it'll be useful for you. So thank you.
We can go over here for the Q&A. So we have some time, probably about 15 minutes, if you like, for questions and answers. I know I took away a number of things from this. The importance of motivation, for example. If you want students to do all that practicing, they better like what it is that they're doing, and that's, I think that's really an important thing.
They don't have to like it. They have to feel it's rewarding. I mean, no, I emphasize those are very different. I mean, because in the study of expertise, you know, lots of people will say, no, I don't like practicing these musical scales, but I recognize the long-term benefit to it and how I'm getting better. And so I just want to stress that's a subtle but quite important distinction.
I'm going to get in with one question, and then we'll turn to the microphone. Yeah. I don't know if you know the answer to this, but you compared. You reported on an experiment that compared two classes, one taught by a top-notch lecturer, another taught by somebody who was not really nearly as expert, but was using different methods. I've talked to faculty, been in that kind of situation, about what the result was in terms of influence in their colleagues in the same department when they saw the result of this. I was wondering if you could tell us anything about what the result was on the colleagues of these faculty.
That's a great question. So what what happened is first the control group. I mean and I go through this because this is really typical. Like I say, I'm working on was working on broad scale, and we see this happen over and over. So he'd come back every month or so for about 6 months with, well, wasn't it due to this, that this could explain? So it wasn't really correct representation. And fortunately, that work, Louis Deslauriers did a very good job of measuring everything and characterizing everything, and could pull out data saying, no, remember, we got data on this, it can't be that. And so after about 6 months, he finally came in and said, okay, I'm convinced you need to teach me how to teach like this. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that's a big section, and so a lot of instructors are involved in it, and basically they all eventually, that was such a compelling example that they've all switched now this year. But it takes time. People have to think through it. It's not just seeing, you don't change your basic belief system by seeing some data and saying, oh, of course, I'll switch from being a Christian to a Muslim or vice versa, or any of these, So it takes some time and thought, but it does happen. I think there's a thing in front. There's microphone, I think, to people hearing in line up. Yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned problem solving and pattern matching.
Yeah.
That reminded me of an incident in my own teaching career. This was during the Vietnam War, and students were very worried about getting poor grades and so on. So I was teaching math at NYU at that time. So I decided to make the calculus exam open book. I thought it would make it easier. What a disaster. The results of the exam were, the averages fell. And what happened was, I noticed during the exam, students were just flipping through the book to match something in the book to the problem that I asked.
Yeah.
So that's an example of the thinking that was going on. I just want to mention there is student feedback via student evaluations. And I want to mention some of the evaluations that I've received over the years and how can one cope with these kind of student attitudes. Here's one. Professor, you talk too much, you explain too much. Cut out the small talk, just give us the formulas. Number 2, this professor makes it awfully tough for the average student to get an A. Finally, this happened, I'm teaching now as an adjunct here at the GW, and this is elementary calculus, and again, the student evaluation, and people are familiar with that famous story of Mozart talking to the emperor after his great opera, the Abduction of the Seraglio. Well, Your Majesty, how did you like my opera? Wonderful music, Herr Mozart, but too many notes. Well, here's my student evaluation. Too many proofs. Your comment, sir.
So this issue of getting student buy-in, so, you know, I won't make a comment on the too many proofs. You may well have had too many proofs. That's we could have that as a separate discussion, you know, as opposed to students doing proofs. But in any case, this issue of going to these much more interactive classes where students have to come to class, they have to actually think, they can't be texting and so on because they're busy involved and stuff. There's a substantial literature on how students are uncomfortable with this and they don't like it and the student evaluations go down. In these 2 big programs I ran at Colorado and UBC, we worried a great deal about that because it's an important factor. And so we focused pretty significantly on how to get student buy-in. And we've now, I'll just make the statement and I could show you data. We've been highly successful at this. And what you have to do a couple of things. You first have to convince the students, I mean, this doesn't apply directly what you were talking about, but it does apply to the kind of changes I'm making here where students are used to lectures and then suddenly they're not getting any lectures. They have to recognize that this isn't just an idiosyncratic experiment on them. And so we actually have all our instructors start out the term by talking a lot about what we know about how people learn and showing them a bunch of this data and showing them why this is being done to help them learn more. And then one kind of comes back a couple times during the term to talk about this more, make them, you know, talk about they can air grievances, but you can make it more explicit of how things are helping their learning, and some more discussions on not just the topic, but about learning the subject and what we know about it. And the bottom line is we now have I've been very successful at that, and so in fact, if anything, the student evaluations go up, although, I mean, I'd say the best data is that they don't really change, that they're largely matched, driven, I'd say, by the personality of the instructors, and that we get instructors teaching radically different ways, students performing differently, but the same instructor gets the same evaluations before and after. That's probably more a testimonial to poorly designed student evaluations. But the bottom line here is you really have to bring, if you bring the students in as, you know, partners in the learning enterprise, be very explicit with them about what you're doing and why, show them how it helps, they buy into it in a very, you know,
is anyone doing anything in mathematics education?
We've got it from all of them, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
The cartoon about my brain being full was funny, but it's very, very pertinent because there's a fairly recent book on decision-making called How We Decide, and they talk about the limitations of the brain, the prefrontal cortex versus the amygdala and so on. We are going more into distance education, distance learning. And I think that has an opportunity, because you don't have to put everything in a 2.5-hour lecture where the students have to sit there all at once. There's an opportunity to interact with the student on a daily basis and to break things up. So although people think that distance education sometimes is inferior, there are a lot of advantage to it, which we also can use in our on-campus courses.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think you just have to be very careful there because, you know, it does offer certain clear benefits, but there's also aspects of it that people, when I looked at research on it, people just not figured out how to get the same kind of interaction, the depth that you can get in a classroom where they're talking to, students are talking to each other, you have the instructor weigh in, and that, you know, like I say, people just haven't demonstrated that they can accomplish that.
We haven't measured yet, but we have some courses where we have on-campus students and distance students working together.
Yeah.
And actually, the distance students do better in many respects than the on-campus students.
They do some in some respects, and in other circumstances they do worse, and it depends on what you're measuring and a bunch of other things. So I'm just saying it's a complicated issue that you have to look at carefully.
Well, I'm a chemist. I became a couple of times a boson and then converted into freon. The state of education in this country reminds me with these reports similar to the time that the first President Bush, he said something, he doesn't like broccoli. So I found later that the Department of Education has given $2 million to a researcher to prove whether broccoli is good for you. And no surprise, after 2 years and wasting taxpayer dollar, they came with the conclusion it's good for you. There's another study.
Is there a question coming out here?
Yes, yes. What I'm saying is this: a number of these reports exist and models exist for excellent education at universities or otherwise. I'm originally from Iran, and we have a system there despite their dictatorship. And that system produces, in this country, the greatest number of BS, MS, PhD CEOs compared to any other countries, simply because there is rigor there and there is expectation. Second example is South Korea. Just look at it in the last 10 years. Tremendous improvement in the education and in economic progress. What we have here is a bunch of reports that are published one after another. None of them are connecting the most important part, which is the K-1, K-12 education to university education. What you articulated is valid for here at universities. But since it has to have a foundation, the foundation has to start from K-1 all the way to K-12.
So I'll just point out that I get this a lot of times when I go to universities, and I'll point out that every one of those teachers at the K-12 level that we point to and all their deficiencies, which are frankly there, but they all went through our university courses. And so, you know, you need to start looking at your students and thinking about how well you're preparing them to go out and be effective teachers before you can point fingers out at the K-12 system, I would argue. Now, you know, I'm not dismissing that as important, but I'm saying that there's an absolutely critical element that all of you have to play, that if you don't, there's nothing that can ever fix the K-12 system.
But the same university that trains that teacher trains people who go to industry. And if they don't perform in industry, they are fired. The reason we have these teachers in the school is that they are not fired.
Okay, this is a longer, separate issue. Right?
I'll say also, while we're waiting for the next question, a lot of the ideas you talked about do work in K-12
Absolutely.
as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking about it as a basic cognitive learning things. There's, taking science to school, science learning in grades K through 8 that the National Academy's done. You just have to change the grade level in every place in the report, and it looks just like what the research at higher ed tells you. So,
yeah, I'm in economics. We have the same issues that you have, the transformation from Homer Simpson thinking to expert thinking. Now, my question is, if this is a general problem, have we thought at all about bringing students into university who are largely Homer Simpsons and actually changing their see, I spend half of the first week of lecture trying to explain to the students what I'm trying to do and how to learn, and that learning is an active activity, not a passive activity. But it would be really, I mean, are any universities actually just taking in the freshmen and saying, okay, here's even a course, or before they start, and say, look, every faculty member wants to achieve this in their class. And they may mention it once or twice during the class, but, because otherwise, it really is kind of a waste of my time to have to keep going over this. And of course, I just gave an exam. I'm going to have to explain to all the ones who do poorly that they didn't do what we told you.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, any universities doing this as a general part of education?
So there's a couple of comments I'll make. So first, the answer is yes, and they're doing it, and it doesn't work. And it really has to do with learning that and training, that these things have to really be put to be effective, that has to be really put into the context of which it's used for it to make sense and for people to grasp it and apply it. So that's one thing. The second thing I'll tell you is virtually every instructor we have who's using our survey and getting that data showing their students are moving down, those, the only ones who will give our survey to their students are the highly committed instructors who are doing much the same things as you are. And we're seeing they're basically failing at it. In fact, and once you start studying more detail, how a student perceives things and how because they're novices in the subject, how they can hear what you're saying in a very different way than what you mean it. They've got different brains, and so that's really what the problem is that this communication mismatch, and that one has to really understand their, instead of thinking about how it means to you and how important it is, you got to understand their brains and figure out how you convey that message to them given their perspectives and values and understandings and even uses of language. So it's, I'm just saying it's complicated, and while you mean well, doing it well, we've found to be surprisingly difficult, is really what our data shows. So it turns out, I'll just say in general, we found it incredibly helpful to get faculty to interview students at depth about these things, and usually it works best if it's not in your course, because there's a certain, but somebody else's class, and you sit there and talk to them, and you learn. I've had this experience over and over. The faculty come out as, these are rational human beings, but they're thinking about this completely differently than I would have realized, than I expected, because they have quite a different perspective than I do. And so that's just always a very valuable and enlightening experience, I would say. Sometimes profoundly humbling.
We've got a few minutes and a longer line of people, so if we can keep the questions going a little bit more
and I'll try
briskly.
and keep my question answers
Right.
started.
I'm going to be brief. This is more of a clarification question, because what I'm taking away from this is that our evaluation techniques don't really matter in the student's development. And I feel like I'm unsatisfied with taking that away from there, And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about things that we can measure that can help develop these expert practices in the students.
Yeah. So, I mean, this goes back to, yeah, how you measure expertise. And so what you really have to do to be effective is, again, go back to sort of look at how an expert decides things, where they're making decisions and what the basis of those decisions are, and then put students in that position of doing things where you only can get the right answer by following the expert decision-making process as opposed to some memorized shortcut, if you like, that can do well on the traditional tests but not really give a good measure of expertise. So that's a quick answer to actually describe a complicated process. But think about what experts are doing and then try and measure how well students do that.
So one comment I often hear is, so I'm supposed to give clickers, and I'm supposed to interact with my students during the lecture and all these things, and it takes so much time away during which I can present material A, B, and C, and won't I have to cut down on, on the amount of teaching I can do? Will my students be able to learn as much as they learned before? And I'd like to your comment on that.
Yeah, I guess my slides aren't up there anymore. So I actually have the next slide is there because I get this question so much. So we've actually looked at this carefully, and the point is the typical classroom in the traditional way is spent so much time with the teacher essentially being as a talking textbook and doing things that can be moved out of class and moved to a much, less expensive medium. And so what we found is that actually in transforming advanced third and fourth year courses, people find they cover more material, actually, and the students are performing better. At the introductory level, what we find usually happens is people find they can actually cover as much material. That was that example I gave for you. Now, it is true that in that controlled experiment, the experiment condition didn't get quite as far, so one of those questions on the test they didn't have covered in class. So on that question, the students in that class only did a little better than they did in the control group rather than a lot better, because they just understood. Even though they hadn't covered the material, they understood it better. But in general, what happens is that people end up cutting about 20% of the material, but they do that not because they have to. They do it because as they're teaching in this way, they're getting a so much deeper understanding of what's reasonable for students to learn and what the difficulties are. They just realize it's a better designed course by dropping those things out. But they don't have to. The point is you move so much out of the classroom, which is unnecessary, that you can do in other ways, that you can cover material. You just have to remember that students can learn things without it coming out of your mouth.
I think that was a great way to finish. I'm sorry. There'll be people outside to help you with directions to lunch. Thanks very much. We'll see you this afternoon.
Every single one of those terms. So, you know what I mean?